Cyril moved through the strange forest with the silent grace of a ghost, each step calculated and precise. Years of survival on this alien world had honed his movements to perfection, teaching him to blend with his surroundings until he became nearly invisible among the crimson foliage. The red leaves rustled faintly beneath his careful footfalls, yet the sound was indistinguishable from the natural whispers of the forest. His weathered face remained expressionless, carved from stone by years of solitude and vigilance, as he approached one of his carefully constructed traps. The morning light filtered through the canopy of blood-red leaves, casting everything in a surreal crimson glow that still felt foreign to him, even after 3 long years on this planet. The air carried the familiar metallic scent that permeated everything on this world, along with the subtle aromas of alien vegetation and the distinctive musk of the local fauna. Cyril breathed it in without conscious thought, his senses constantly cataloging his surroundings for any sign of danger. His trap had worked perfectly. A 6-legged creature, resembling an unsettling hybrid between a deer and a lizard, lay dead, impaled by the spring-loaded spear mechanism he had set the previous day. Its iridescent scales caught the filtered sunlight, shimmering with colors that had no names in human language. The creature's eyes, glazed over in death, reflected the red canopy above like twin pools of blood. Cyril allowed himself the briefest moment of satisfaction, not at the kill itself, but at the continued effectiveness of his survival skills. Kneeling beside the carcass with practiced efficiency, Cyril retrieved his hunting knife from its sheath at his belt. The blade appeared in his hand with fluid speed, evidence of countless repetitions of this same ritual. Without hesitation or sentimentality, he began field dressing the animal. His movements were precise and economical, taking only what he needed: portions of meat that would provide the most nutrition with the least risk of alien pathogens, the tougher scales that could be fashioned into lightweight armor, sinews that would make strong cord for his traps and tools. Nothing was wasted, nothing unnecessary was taken. The forest had taught him harsh lessons about efficiency. For Cyril, this wasn't a victory to celebrate or an accomplishment to take pride in. It was merely survival, another day of maintaining his solitary existence in a world that seemed designed to eliminate humans through countless methods, both subtle and overt. 3 long years had passed since the colony ship had broken apart in the atmosphere. 3 years since he had watched in helpless horror as burning fragments of humanity's hopes scattered across the alien sky like dying stars. 3 years of absolute solitude, of constant vigilance, of adapting to environmental challenges that claimed the lives of those less determined or less fortunate. The memories of that day still haunted his dreams, the screams over the communication system as compartments decompressed, the sickening lurch as the ship began its uncontrolled descent, the desperate scramble for escape pods. Cyril had launched alone, his pods separating cleanly, but the violent entry into the atmosphere had knocked him unconscious. When he awoke, his pod had crash-landed in the Crimson Forest, its systems damaged beyond repair. He had survived with nothing but the emergency supplies in the bomb and whatever skills he could remember from his military training on Earth. Those first weeks had been a desperate struggle for basic survival. Through painful trial and error, he had learned which local flora was poisonous to humans, which predators hunted at night, which weather patterns preceded the caustic rainstorms that could burn unprotected skin. The learning curve had been steep and unforgiving. Several times he had come close to death, from infection, from injuries, from consuming the wrong plants. But something inside him, some stubborn kernel of human resilience, had refused to surrender. Cyril wrapped his bounty in a piece of cured leather and secured it to his back before moving on to check his main trap. This one was more elaborate, a sophisticated system of counterweights and triggers that would hoist anything heavy enough up into the air, ensnared in a net woven from the tough vines that grew near the acidic pools in the Eastern Valley. He had designed it primarily for the winged predators that sometimes hunted in these lowland lands. Their meat was stringy and gamey, but provided nutrients he couldn't find elsewhere, and their talons made excellent arrowheads and tools when properly treated. As Cyril approached the clearing where he had set the trap, he heard something unusual: sobbing. The sound was unmistakably similar to human crying, though with subtle tonal differences that marked it as something alien. He froze instantly, all his senses sharpening with sudden alertness. The colony ship had carried over 200 people, but in 3 years he hadn't encountered a single human survivor. The sobbing continued, punctuated by what sounded like frightened gasps and a strange melodic keening that no human throat could produce. Caution warred with curiosity in his mind. Curiosity and something else he had almost forgotten. Concern for another living being. The emotion felt rusty, almost painful as it resurfaced after years of focusing exclusively on his own survival. Cyril moved forward with extreme caution, each step carefully placed to avoid announcing his presence. The undergrowth provided ample cover as he crept toward the source of the sounds, his hand instinctively resting on the knife at his belt. Through the screen of red foliage, he could now see that his trap had been triggered, but it hadn't caught one of the winged predators he had expected. Instead, suspended 3 meters above the ground in the vine net, a small, struggling figure twisted and turned, trying vainly to free itself from the entanglement. A child, an alien child. Her skin was pale blue, almost luminescent in the dappled light filtering through the canopy. White hair so pale it seemed to capture and reflect the crimson light around them, framed a face that was surprisingly human-like in its features, yet undeniably alien. She had 2 arms, 2 legs, a head proportioned much like a human child's, but the blue skin and slightly elongated limbs marked her unmistakably as one of the native inhabitants of this world, the people Cyril had been meticulously careful to avoid since witnessing their brutal hunting rituals during his first year of isolation. The girl spotted him through the foliage and went instantly silent mid-sob, her strange violet eyes widening with unmistakable fear. They were extraordinary eyes, not just in their unusual coloration, but in their expressiveness, so similar to human eyes that Cyril felt an immediate and unexpected connection. She couldn't have been older than 6 or 7 by human standards, judging by her size and proportions. Tears streaked her blue cheeks, leaving faint trails that seemed to shimmer in the dappled light. Cyril stood motionless, considering his options with the careful deliberation that had kept him alive for 3 years in this hostile environment. The wise choice, the survivor's choice, would be to leave her. Getting involved with the indigenous people could only lead to trouble. They were territorial and fierce, with technological development roughly equivalent to Earth's Bronze Age, but physical strength that far exceeded human capabilities. He had watched them from hiding as they hunted creatures 3 times their size, bringing them down with coordinated attacks that demonstrated both intelligence and ruthless efficiency. As Cyril watched, the girl began to tremble visibly, whether from fear of him or from the physical strain of being suspended in the net, he couldn't determine. Her violet eyes never left his face, and in them he could read emotions that transcended the barrier between their species. Fear, yes, but also a desperate, pleading hope. The universal language of a child in distress. Something shifted inside Cyril's chest, a painful loosening of the emotional armor he had constructed around himself over 3 years of isolation. The strategic decision remained clear. He should walk away, preserve his isolation, avoid potential conflict with the indigenous population. But another part of him, a part he had thought long dormant, rebelled against this cold calculation. With a resigned sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his internal conflict, Cyril stepped fully into the clearing, revealing himself completely to the trapped child. He moved slowly, making his movements deliberate and non-threatening as he drew his knife from its sheath. The girl flinched violently at the sight of the blade, pressing herself against the far side of the net in a futile attempt to distance herself from what she clearly perceived as a threat. Her small body trembled more intensely, and fresh tears welled in her violet eyes. Cyril paused, then purposefully held the knife where she could clearly see it. With slow, exaggerated movements, he pointed to the counterweight rope that held the net suspended, then back to the knife, trying to communicate his intentions without words. The girl watched him with wary intensity, her breathing rapid and shallow with fear. With a single, swift movement, Cyril cut the counterweight rope. The tension released with a soft whir of fiber against wood, and the net descended gently to the forest floor, settling into a tangled heap with the girl still entwined within it. She lay still for several heartbeats, perhaps expecting some form of attack. When none came, she cautiously began to extricate herself from the tangled vines, her movements hampered by fear and the complex knots of the net. Once free, she didn't bolt immediately as Cyril had expected. Instead, she rose to her feet with surprising dignity for one so young and pointed urgently toward a distant ridge visible through a gap in the forest canopy. Cyril followed her gesture and felt a cold weight settle in his stomach at what he saw. A procession of warriors moved along the ridge, their blue skin distinct even at this distance. They walked with the confident, measured pace of experienced hunters who knew they were closing in on their prey. At their head strode a particularly tall figure, carrying what appeared to be a ceremonial spear adorned with what might have been feathers or some equivalent decoration. The leader's posture radiated authority and determination. Their direction and pace suggested they were tracking something or someone with focused intent. The girl looked up at Cyril, her violet eyes brimming with an emotion that required no translation across species barriers. Pure, desperate fear. "Hide," she said in a trembling voice, the human word coming from her alien mouth with surprising clarity. "Please." Her use of a human word startled Cyril almost as much as her apparent understanding of his language. It suggested contact with humans, perhaps observation of the colonists before the disaster, or even interaction with other survivors he hadn't encountered. The implications raced through his mind, but the immediate situation demanded his full attention. Cyril glanced back at the warriors on the ridge, then down at the small, frightened child before him. The calculation was simple on its face. Getting involved was dangerous, potentially fatal. These people were not to be trifled with. He had seen them hunt with terrifying efficiency. He had observed their combat training from hiding, witnessed their strength and speed. He had glimpsed their rituals from a distance, complex ceremonies involving blood and fire that he couldn't begin to comprehend. Helping the girl meant risking the wrath of her entire tribe, painting a target on himself after 3 years of successful anonymity. And yet, there was something in her eyes, a desperate, pleading fear that resonated within him on a level deeper than rational calculation. He recognized that expression. He had seen that same desperate fear reflected in still pools of water during his first months on this world, when survival had seemed impossible and isolation had threatened to break his spirit. The look of someone who had nowhere else to turn, no other hope to cling to. In that moment, Cyril made a decision that violated every survival instinct he had developed over 3 years of solitude. With a heavy sigh that carried the weight of his misgivings, he gave the girl a single, decisive nod. Turning slightly, he gestured for her to follow him, then began walking swiftly toward the rocky outcroppings in the western hills where he had established his hidden camp. The location offered natural defenses and multiple escape routes, advantages they might soon need. The girl hesitated only briefly before hurrying after him, her small feet nearly silent on the forest floor. Despite her obvious fear in the stressful situation, she moved with impressive coordination for a child her age, mimicking his careful placement of feet and avoiding fallen branches that might snap and betray their location. Whatever her circumstances, she clearly understood the need for stealth. They traveled in tense silence, Cyril frequently adjusting their course to minimize the trail they left behind. He led them through a shallow stream for several hundred meters, their feet finding purchase on submerged stones to avoid leaving prints in the soft banks. The girl kept pace surprisingly well, occasionally glancing over her shoulder toward the ridge where they had last seen her pursuers. Each time she looked back, her pace quickened slightly, driven by the very real fear of what followed them. As the afternoon shadows lengthened into early evening, they reached the foothills that marked the beginning of the Western Highlands. Here, the terrain grew increasingly rocky, offering fewer opportunities to leave tracks, but demanding more careful navigation. Cyril noted with approval that the girl adapted quickly to the changing landscape, instinctively seeking the harder surfaces that wouldn't retain footprints. Whatever her age, she had clearly absorbed important survival skills. The sun was setting when they finally reached Cyril's camp, a small, deep cave set into the side of a steep cliff, its entrance concealed by a carefully arranged curtain of hanging vines supplemented with branches woven to match the surrounding vegetation. From even a short distance away, the cave entrance was virtually invisible against the rocky backdrop. Cyril parted the camouflage and gestured for the girl to enter before him. She hesitated momentarily, understandably wary of entering an enclosed space with a stranger, but the distant sound of a hunting horn from somewhere behind them decided the matter. She ducked quickly inside, with Cyril following immediately after, carefully rearranging the camouflaged entrance to conceal any sign of their passage. Inside, the cave opened into a space larger than its entrance suggested. The girl looked around with undisguised curiosity at what had been Cyril's solitary home for the past 2 years, after he had abandoned his crash site in search of more defensible terrain. The space was spartanly organized but showed evidence of long-term habitation. A sleeping area of carefully cured animal furs occupied one corner. A small fire pit near the mouth of the cave was positioned to allow smoke to escape through natural vents in the rock, while minimizing visible light from outside. Weapons and tools hung from pegs driven into cracks in the stone walls. Spears, a bow, various knives, all crafted from local materials with remarkable ingenuity. Stores of dried meat, gathered plants, and containers of water were neatly arranged along one wall. Everything had its place. Everything served a purpose. The girl took in these details with quick, assessing glances, her initial fear giving way somewhat to what appeared to be genuine curiosity about his living arrangements. Cyril gestured for her to sit on a flat stone near the fire pit, then set about building a small, controlled fire. The nights on this world were dangerously cold, far colder than the temperate days, and hypothermia was a real risk without adequate heat. As flames caught and began to illuminate the cave with warm, flickering light, Cyril had his first clear view of his unexpected guest. The girl's blue skin showed signs of minor scratches and bruises, evidence of a difficult journey even before she had encountered his trap. Her clothing was simple but functional, a tunic-like garment made from what appeared to be woven plant fibers, belted at the waist, with leggings of the same material. A small leather bag hung at her side, secured with a drawstring. Most striking was her completely white hair, which contrasted dramatically with her blue skin and violet eyes. Despite her alien appearance, her expressions and body language were remarkably human-like, allowing Cyril to read her emotional state with surprising accuracy. Cyril prepared a simple meal from his stored provisions, offering a portion to the girl on a flat piece of bark that served as a plate. She accepted it with a solemn nod of thanks, but ate cautiously, examining each item before consuming it in small, careful bites. Her eyes never left him for long, tracking his every movement with the wariness of prey in the presence of a potential predator. Yet beneath that wariness, Cyril sensed curiosity and perhaps a tentative hope that she had found sanctuary. After they had eaten in silence, Cyril laid out an old but clean animal hide for her to sleep on, positioning it near the fire for warmth, but not so close as to risk sparks or excessive heat. The girl looked exhausted, the adrenaline of fear clearly giving way to the bone-deep weariness that follows sustained terror. She curled up beneath the hide, drawing it around her small shoulders like armor. Within minutes, her breathing had deepened into the rhythm of sleep, though occasional twitches and soft sounds suggested her rest was troubled by dreams or memories. Cyril remained awake, positioned near the camouflaged entrance where he could monitor any approach. Sleep wouldn't come easily tonight, not with the complication of an alien child and pursuing warriors added to his normally solitary existence. His mind raced with questions about the girl, her pursuers, and what trouble he might have invited by helping her. Eventually, his gaze fell on the small leather bag the girl carried. It lay beside her sleeping form, within easy reach should she wake suddenly. The survivor in him urged caution and investigation. Who was she? Why was she being pursued by her own people? What might she be carrying that could provide answers, or, more importantly, warn of dangers? After a moment's ethical debate, Cyril moved silently across the cave floor and carefully lifted the bag without disturbing the sleeping child. The weight was minimal, suggesting few contents. Opening it cautiously, he found only 2 items, but both sent a chill of apprehension through him. The first was a ritual dagger made of obsidian, its blade still sticky with fresh blood that appeared dark purple in the firelight. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the blade napped to deadly sharpness, the handle inlaid with what looked like bone or ivory carved with intricate designs that might have been writing or symbolic decoration. This was no ordinary tool, but an object of ceremonial significance, its presence in a child's possession deeply troubling. The second item was a piece of leather cured and stretched thin enough to serve as a writing surface. A crude but effective map had been drawn on it with what might have been charcoal or some equivalent material. Cyril recognized local landmarks he had come to know during his years of exploration: the ridge they had seen earlier, the river that cut through the Central Valley, and the forest where his traps were set. A destination was marked with a symbol he didn't recognize, but words in what must be the alien language were written beside it. The only sequence he could interpret, having learned a small vocabulary through careful observation of the indigenous people, were sounds that approximated silent peaks. a craggy mountain range about 2 days' journey to the north that he had never explored due to its remote location and treacherous terrain. The blood on the dagger disturbed him deeply. Had this child hurt someone? Was she dangerous despite her size and apparent vulnerability? The contradiction between her frightened demeanor and the bloody weapon raised alarming possibilities. A small sound drew his attention back to the girl. She was awake, watching him with those unnerving violet eyes that seemed too knowing for her young age. She had seen him examining her possessions. There was no point in pretending otherwise. "Why blood?" Cyril asked directly, his voice rough from disuse, holding up the dagger where she could see it clearly in the firelight. The sudden sound of human speech after so long without conversation felt strange in his throat, almost painful. Fear flickered across the girl's face at the sight of the weapon in his hand, but there was something else visible in her expression too, a flash of defiance, perhaps even pride, quickly subsumed again by caution. She sat up slowly, pulling the animal hide around her shoulders like a cloak, watching him with intense concentration. "First blood ritual," she said haltingly, her command of human language unexpected and impressive despite the obvious struggle with pronunciation. Some of the indigenous people had learned basic communication from observing the human colonists before the disaster, but most avoided anything associated with the newcomers, treating them with suspicion or outright hostility. Cyril frowned, the unfamiliar expression making his facial muscles ache after years of solitary stoicism. "First blood ritual," he repeated, not understanding the significance. The girl reached out a small blue hand and touched the dagger still held in his larger human one, the contrast between their skin tones stark in the firelight. "I's chosen," she continued, clearly struggling to find the right words in his language. "Drink blood, kill prisoner, become warrior." Understanding dawned on Cyril with cold clarity, some kind of initiation rite, a forced passage into the warrior culture he had observed from a distance. But she was so young, surely too young for such brutality. "I say no." The girl's expression hardened momentarily, a flash of fierce determination transforming her childlike features. "Hurt priest. Run away." She pantomimed a stabbing motion, then pointed to the dark stains on the obsidian blade, her meaning unmistakable. "His blood?" Cyril asked, the implications becoming clearer and more troubling. She nodded solemnly, her violet eyes never leaving his face, perhaps trying to gauge his reaction to this confession. "Father hunts me now," she added, gesturing toward the ridge where they had seen the warriors. "I dishonor tribe, break sacred law." Cyril carefully set the dagger down between them on the cave floor, a neutral territory. This explained the determined pursuit they had witnessed. She hadn't merely wandered away or gotten lost in the forest. She had committed what her people considered a serious transgression. Refusing to participate in their ritual, attacking a priest, fleeing with a sacred object. No wonder they hunted her with such grim determination. The situation was far more complicated than a simple lost child. "Where go?" he asked, pointing to the map with its mysterious destination. "Silent Peaks," she replied without hesitation, as if the answer had been rehearsed in anticipation of this question. "Old One lives there. She helped me." "Old One?" Cyril made a gesture mimicking an elderly person, hunched and walking with difficulty. The girl nodded with what seemed like eagerness. "She leave tribe long ago, like me." She hesitated, then added with obvious effort, "She know human words, many words. Teach me some." This new information added yet another layer of complexity to the situation. The Silent Peaks were forbidding terrain by any standard. Sheer cliffs, narrow paths, unpredictable weather patterns that could trap the unwary. But if there was someone there who might shelter the girl, someone who had also rejected the tribe's violent ways and perhaps even maintained some connection to human colonists. "Your name?" Cyril asked, the question feeling strange after years of having no one to address. "Ariadna," she replied with careful enunciation, as if the name held special significance to her. Then pointing at him with unexpected directness, "Your name?" "Cyril," he said, the sound of his own name in his voice feeling like a reconnection to a past life, a person he had almost forgotten in the daily struggle for survival. Ariadna nodded gravely, as if committing it to memory with the seriousness of a formal pact. "Sleep now?" she said with surprising authority for one so young, lying back down and pulling the hide around her. "Tomorrow, go Silent Peaks." Cyril watched as she closed her eyes again, her small form curling into a tight protective ball beneath the animal hide. Her apparent trust was surprising after what she must have been through, though he noted she had carefully retrieved the dagger and map, returning them to her bag, which she now clutched against her chest, even as she drifted back towards sleep. He returned to his position near the cave entrance, but remained acutely alert, listening for any sounds that might indicate they had been followed or discovered. The revelation about the ritual dagger and the girl's desperate actions had transformed the situation from merely risky to potentially catastrophic. He was now harboring not just a lost child, but a fugitive from indigenous justice, one who had attacked a religious figure and stolen a sacred object. The response, should they be discovered, would likely be swift and merciless. Still, something about their brutal ritual disturbed him profoundly. Forcing a child to kill and drink blood to prove her worth as a warrior, it seemed unnecessarily cruel, a corruption of natural development into something monstrous. Perhaps there were aspects of their culture he would never understand as an outsider, but he couldn't bring himself to return Ariadne to what seemed like certain punishment, possibly even death. As the night deepened around them, Cyril made his decision, not with any sense of heroism or nobility, but with the same pragmatic determination that had kept him alive for 3 years. He would help her reach the Silent Peaks. After that, their paths would diverge. He would return to his solitary existence, and she would have to find her own way forward with this old one, whoever they might be, just as he had found his own path in this hostile world. The first pale light of dawn found them already moving, their few preparations completed in near silence. Cyril had woken Ariadne before sunrise, allowing them to begin their journey while the forest was still shrouded in pre-dawn mist that would help conceal their movements. He had repacked his most essential supplies into a small, easily carried bundle: dried meat, water in a container made from a hollowed gourd, fire-starting materials, and basic medical supplies. To these he added his bow and a quiver of arrows, a spear that could double as a walking staff, and his most reliable hunting knife. Anything else they might need would have to be found or made along the way. They traveled quickly but with extreme caution, Cyril constantly checking for signs that they were being followed or tracked. The terrain worked in their favor initially, rocky ground that held few tracks, but they would eventually need to cross softer earth where their passage would be more visible to experienced trackers. Cyril led them on a circuitous route, doubling back occasionally, using streams to mask their trail, always conscious of leaving as little evidence of their direction as possible. By mid-morning, they had reached the river, a wide, swift-flowing barrier that cut through the central valley of this region. Cyril had planned to follow it upstream, using the water to help mask their trail. He paused at the bank, crouching to refill his water container, while Ariadne waited tensely beside him, her violet eyes scanning their surroundings with the alertness of prey that knows it's being hunted. That's when he saw them, two blue-skinned warriors on the opposite bank, examining the ground with focused intensity. Unlike Ariadne, these were full adults, their blue skin marked with the white patterns that seemed to indicate status or achievement among their people. They moved with confidence and purpose, systematically studying the terrain. Trackers, obviously looking for signs of passage. They were methodical and careful, exactly what Cyril would expect from hunters accustomed to tracking prey through difficult terrain. He pulled Ariadne down beside him into the cover of the riverbank vegetation with one fluid movement, his hand covering her mouth to prevent any sound of surprise. They watched in tense silence as the trackers moved along the far bank, their eyes never leaving the ground, occasionally kneeling to examine something more closely. Their focus and skill were evident even from this distance. "Father's best hunters," Ariadne whispered once Cyril had removed his hand from her mouth, her voice barely audible above the gurgling of the river. "They find anything, follow any trail, never stop." Cyril nodded grimly, understanding the implications. These weren't random searchers or a general patrol. They were skilled trackers, specifically chosen for their abilities. And they were heading toward the area where his traps were set, where they had first encountered each other. Once there, they would find signs of his long-term presence, and the hunt would focus on him as well as Ariadne. His days of anonymous survival were likely coming to an end, regardless of what happened next. "Move faster," he told her with quiet urgency, getting to his feet but staying low within the cover of the vegetation. "They find my traps soon. Know someone helps you." They continued upstream, no longer able to enjoy the luxury of careful, trackless movement. Speed had become essential. Cyril set a pace that would have been challenging for an adult human, but Ariadne kept up without complaint, her alien physiology perhaps better adapted to sustained exertion. Only the occasional quick breath or the tightening of her expression revealed the effort it cost her to maintain the rapid pace. By midday, they had left the river behind and begun the ascent into the foothills that led toward the silent peaks, visible now as distant, jagged silhouettes against the horizon. The terrain became increasingly rocky and vertical, offering fewer opportunities to leave tracks, but making the going considerably tougher. They paused in the shadow of a large boulder, taking shelter from the harsh midday sun that beat down with unforgiving intensity. Cyril offered Ariadne water and some dried meat from his provisions. As they ate in silence, he studied her with greater attention than he had allowed himself previously. Despite her alien appearance, her expressions and body language were remarkably human-like in many respects, allowing him to read her emotional state with surprising accuracy. Currently, her face showed exhaustion, but also unwavering determination, a refusal to surrender to fear or fatigue that seemed incongruous with her apparent age. "Rest short time," he told her, noticing the subtle signs of strain despite her attempts to appear strong. "Then I teach you walk on rocks. No tracks." She nodded, finishing her small portion of food with the careful conservation of someone who understood that resources were precious and might need to last. After they had rested for perhaps 15 minutes, all the delay Cyril dared allow, he led her to a nearby stretch of rocky ground and demonstrated how to step from stone to stone, leaving no footprints and making minimal noise that might alert pursuers. "Watch," he instructed, showing her how to test each stone before putting her full weight on it, how to balance her body to move fluidly across uneven surfaces, how to recognize which rocks might shift or slide under pressure. Ariadne observed with intense concentration, her violet eyes missing nothing. Then she tried it herself, mimicking his movements. Her first attempts were clumsy and uncertain, but she learned with remarkable speed, adapting his techniques to her smaller size and different center of balance. "Good," Cyril acknowledged after she had successfully navigated a difficult stretch without dislodging a single stone. A ghost of a smile crossed Ariadne's face at the praise, the first he had seen from her, transforming her features from merely alien to something approaching beautiful in its genuineness. The expression vanished quickly, but its brief appearance suggested the child beneath the fear and desperate circumstances. They continued their journey with renewed focus, now moving more carefully, but still maintaining a steady pace. Cyril found himself increasingly impressed by the girl's resilience and quick learning. She wasn't merely following him passively. She was actively adapting to their situation, picking up survival skills with an intuition that transcended her years and the barriers between their species. As the afternoon waned toward evening, they reached a narrow mountain path that wound upward between steep cliffs. It was a natural bottleneck in the terrain, easier to traverse than the surrounding slopes, but also easier to be trapped within. Cyril hesitated before committing them to this route, scanning the path ahead and the cliffs above for any sign of danger or ambush. His instincts, honed by years of survival, prickled with warning. His caution was justified. They had traveled perhaps a few hundred meters along the path when a sound made him freeze in place, a small cascade of pebbles from above, the subtle but unmistakable sign of movement on the cliffs. Cyril pulled Ariadne against the cliff wall, pressing both of them into what meager shadow it provided, his body instinctively shielding her smaller form. Not a moment too soon. Two blue-skinned warriors appeared around a bend in the path ahead, moving with the confident, measured pace of hunters who believed they were closing in on their prey. These weren't the same trackers they had seen by the river. These were different warriors, which meant the search had spread out, with multiple groups covering different potential escape routes. The hunters had correctly guessed their destination and were cutting off possible paths to the silent peaks. Cyril assessed their situation with cold clarity. There was nowhere to run. The path was too narrow, with a sheer drop on one side and a vertical cliff on the other. To retreat would mean running directly into more pursuers who were likely following their trail. To advance would mean direct confrontation with the warriors ahead. They were effectively trapped. Cyril made his decision instantly, based on combat experience and the simple math of survival. He pushed Ariadne deeper into a small recess in the cliff face where two rock formations created a natural hiding spot. "Stay," he commanded in a whisper, his tone allowing no argument, no sound, no movement. The fear in Ariadne's eyes was palpable, but she nodded once, understanding the gravity of the situation. Cyril saw her press herself as far back into the recess as possible, making herself nearly invisible in the shadows. He unslung his bow from his shoulder and nocked an arrow with practiced efficiency. He rarely used the weapon for hunting, preferring the reliability of traps for food acquisition, but he had maintained his skill through regular practice. Now that skill would be tested against intelligent opponents who vastly outmatched him in physical strength. The warriors continued forward, unaware of the ambush. They moved with the confidence of predators who sensed their prey was near. Their attention focused on the path ahead rather than the shadows along the cliff face. Cyril took a deep breath to steady himself, drew back the bowstring with controlled power, aimed with deliberate care, and released. The arrow flew true, covering the distance in a heartbeat and catching the lead warrior in the throat, one of the few vulnerable points not protected by their naturally tougher skin. The warrior fell without a sound, his hands clutching at the shaft protruding from his neck, dark purple blood spilling between his fingers. He collapsed to his knees, then toppled forward onto the rocky path. The second warrior reacted with impressive speed, instantly dropping into a defensive crouch, drawing a wicked-looking blade from a sheath at his waist. His eyes scanned the path ahead, quickly finding Cyril despite his attempt to remain concealed. A sound emerged from the warrior's throat. Not a cry of alarm, but a low, threatening growl that raised the hairs on the back of Cyril's neck. There was no time for another arrow. Cyril dropped his bow and drew his hunting knife, bracing himself as the warrior charged with frightening speed. The blue-skinned fighter moved faster than any human Cyril had ever faced, covering the distance between them in a blur of motion. But Cyril had survived 3 years on this world by being adaptable and unpredictable, qualities that had served him against both animal predators and environmental hazards. As the warrior closed in, Cyril feinted to the left, then dropped suddenly to his right, using the narrow confines of the path to his advantage. The warrior's momentum carried him slightly past Cyril's position, giving Cyril a split-second opportunity to slash at the back of his opponent's leg as he passed. The blade bit deep, drawing dark purple blood that seemed almost black in the fading light. But the wound didn't stop the warrior or even significantly slow him. He spun around with surprising agility despite his injury, his own blade slicing through the air where Cyril's head had been a moment before. What followed was not a heroic battle between equals, but a desperate struggle for survival. Cyril harbored no illusions about matching the indigenous warrior for raw strength or speed. Instead, he fought defensively, using the terrain and his knowledge of human fighting techniques that might be unfamiliar to his opponent. He gave ground deliberately, leading the warrior along the path, looking for any advantage the environment might offer. The warrior pressed his attack relentlessly, his blade moving in complex patterns that suggested years of formal training. One sweeping strike caught Cyril's arm, cutting a deep gash just below his shoulder. Pain flared like fire along his nerve endings, but Cyril forced himself to ignore it, knowing that any distraction would mean instant death. He continued to give ground strategically, working his way towards a section of the path where the cliff face jutted out slightly, creating a potential tactical advantage. Blood ran freely down his arm, making his grip on the knife slippery and uncertain. The warrior sensed weakness and pressed harder, his attacks becoming more aggressive, more confident. Cyril felt his strength beginning to ebb, the combination of blood loss and the sustained exertion of combat taking its toll. He needed to end this quickly, or he wouldn't survive to see the outcome. When they reached the jutting section of cliff, Cyril abruptly changed tactics. Instead of continuing his defensive retreat, he lunged forward with every remaining ounce of strength, ducking under the warrior's blade and slamming his shoulder into the blue-skinned fighter's midsection. The impact sent pain shooting through his wounded arm, but it had the desired effect. The warrior staggered backward, momentarily off balance from the unexpected aggression and change in fighting style. That momentary imbalance was all Cyril needed. With a powerful shove fueled by desperation and the knowledge that this was his only chance, he pushed the warrior toward the edge of the path where the drop-off waited. The blue-skinned fighter's arms windmilled as he fought for balance, his face registering shock at the sudden reversal. For a suspended moment, he teetered on the brink, his eyes locking with Cyril's in a flash of recognition and something that might have been respect. Then momentum won, and with a roar of defiance that echoed through the mountain pass, he toppled backward over the edge, into empty space. His scream continued briefly, growing fainter with distance, before being abruptly silenced by impact far below. Cyril stood motionless, his breathing ragged, feeling the warm flow of blood down his arm and the burning pain of the wound. Survival instinct snapped him out of momentary shock. He quickly retrieved his bow and the arrow he'd used, eliminating evidence of his specific weapons. Then he returned to where Ariadne remained hidden in the recess of the cliff face. She emerged cautiously, her violet eyes wide with a complex mixture of fear, awe, and something that might have been guilt. She looked at the fallen warrior on the path, then at Cyril's bleeding arm, making the connection between his injury and her safety. "You killed them," she said, her voice steady despite the gravity of her words. It wasn't a question or an accusation, merely a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of what he had done on her behalf. Cyril nodded grimly, applying pressure to his wounded arm to slow the bleeding. "Had to," he replied simply. "No choice. Come now. Others will find them soon. Must move quickly." They continued along the path with renewed urgency, moving as fast as caution and Cyril's injury would allow. He bound his wounded arm with a strip of cloth torn from his shirt, creating a makeshift pressure bandage. But blood continued to seep through the improvised dressing. The pain was manageable for now through sheer force of will, but he knew infection was a serious risk. On this world, even small wounds could become deadly if not properly treated, as he had learned through painful experience during his first year. By nightfall, they had reached a small plateau where the path widened enough to provide a defensible position for a brief rest. There was no question of risking a fire. The light would be visible for miles in the mountain darkness and would serve as a beacon to their pursuers. Instead, they huddled together for warmth, sharing Cyril's blanket, their breath visible as small clouds in the rapidly cooling air. "Arm bad?" Ariadne asked, eyeing the blood-soaked bandage with obvious concern. Her voice held a note of responsibility, a child's understanding that his injury had been incurred for her protection. "Had worse," Cyril replied with forced nonchalance, though the truth was the wound concerned him greatly. The indigenous warriors sometimes treated their blades with substances that promoted bleeding or caused inflammation. Whether this was deliberate biological warfare or simply an unintended byproduct of their crafting methods, he didn't know, but he had observed the effects from a distance. Wounds that should have been survivable turning septic with alarming speed, leading to the lingering deaths of injured animals the warriors tracked after combat. Ariadne studied his face with unexpected perceptiveness, clearly not convinced by his stoic response. Without further comment, she slipped away from the shared blanket, disappearing into the darkness of the plateau. Cyril tensed, alert for any sound that might indicate trouble, but she returned several minutes later with her small hands full of vegetation he had never seen before. Broad, waxy leaves with serrated edges and a faint blue-green luminescence barely visible in the darkness. "For blood," she explained, sitting down beside him with the serious demeanor of a healer much older than her years. She selected one of the largest leaves and, to Cyril's surprise, put it in her mouth, chewing it methodically into a pulp. When she had reduced it to a greenish paste, she carefully removed his blood-soaked bandage and applied the masticated plant matter directly to his wound. Cyril winced at the initial contact, a sharp sting spreading across the injured tissue. But almost immediately afterward, a cooling sensation began to replace the pain, spreading outward from the site of application. The bleeding, which had continued steadily since the fight, noticeably slowed within moments of the treatment. "What plant?" he asked, genuine curiosity momentarily overriding his concern about their pursuers and the dangers that still lay ahead. "Bloodstop," Ariadne replied matter-of-factly, methodically chewing a second leaf to create more of the medicinal paste. "Hunters use when spear cuts wrong, when hunt goes bad. Very strong medicine. Stop blood, fight sickness in wounds." She applied the second poultice to his injury with surprising dexterity for hands so small, then bound the healing paste in place with a fresh strip of cloth torn from her own tunic, sacrificing a piece of her limited clothing for his benefit. "Thank you," Cyril said when she had finished, the words feeling rusty and inadequate after years without the need for gratitude or connection to another being. Ariadne looked up at him, her violet eyes catching what little starlight filtered through the high mountain clouds. The intensity of her gaze made her seem ancient despite her child's body, as if she carried wisdom far beyond her years. "You fight for me," she said with simple directness. "I heal for you. Fair exchange." It was the longest and most complex exchange they had shared, and in it, Cyril sensed the foundation of something beyond mere necessity, a tentative trust forming between them, a recognition of mutual dependence in a hostile world. He nodded once, acknowledging her words and the implicit pact they contained, then gestured for her to return to the shelter of the blanket. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and they would need all their strength for what lay ahead. As Ariadne drifted toward sleep, curled against him for warmth, Cyril remained vigilant, alert to any sounds that might indicate pursuit. His mind turned to the warriors he had killed. By now, their bodies would have been discovered. The hunt would intensify, driven not just by the need to recover Ariadne, but by the desire for vengeance against the human who had killed their tribesmen. And leading the hunters would be the tall warrior they had seen on the ridge, Ariadne's father, if her account was accurate. The thought unsettled him deeply. In his 3 years on this world, Cyril had learned to hunt, to trap, to survive against the elements and predators. But he had never directly opposed the indigenous people, never made himself their enemy until today. He had shifted from being a solitary survivor, existing on the fringes of their awareness, to becoming an active threat, someone they would hunt with the full force of their considerable skills and knowledge of the terrain. He glanced down at Ariadne's sleeping form, her features relaxed in slumber despite the precariousness of their situation. What was it about this child that had compelled him to risk everything? Perhaps it was simply that she represented the first real human connection, despite her alien nature, that he had experienced in years of isolation. Or perhaps it was the recognition of her refusal to become what others demanded she be, a mirror of his own decision to forge an independent path on this unforgiving world rather than surrender to despair after the colony ship disaster. Whatever the complex mixture of motivations, he was committed now beyond any possibility of turning back. They would reach the silent peaks, find this old one who might help Ariadne, and then Cyril didn't allow himself to think beyond that immediate goal. In a world this dangerous, planning too far ahead was a luxury he couldn't afford. Survival meant focusing on the next step, the next challenge, the next day. Tomorrow would bring new dangers. He would face them as they came, one by one. The scene shifted to a different location on the mountain path, where the first light of dawn illuminated a grim tableau. A tall figure stood over the body of the warrior Cyril had killed with his arrow. In the pale morning light, his blue skin appeared almost black in the shadows, but the white markings that decorated his arms and face stood out starkly, elaborate patterns that spoke of rank, achievement, and lineage to those who could read their significance. Enoch, war chief of the Crystal Waters tribe and father to Ariadne, knelt beside the fallen warrior with ceremonial dignity. His face, more angular and severe than his daughter's, betrayed little emotion as he examined the fatal wound with clinical detachment. With gentle, almost reverent movements, he closed the dead man's eyes, murmuring words in their native language that might have been a prayer or a promise of vengeance. Then, his expression hardening into something implacable, he examined the arrow wound with greater attention to detail. This was not the work of a predator or a rival tribe. The arrow's craftsmanship was distinctive, human-made, with fletching techniques unique to the off-worlders who had fallen from the sky 3 cycles ago. Enoch rose to his full impressive height, turning to address the small group of elite warriors who accompanied him. They watched him with expressions of controlled anger and respect, waiting for his command. "The off-worlder has her," he stated, his deep voice calm despite the cold fury evident in his violet eyes. "A human protects my daughter and defies our sacred ways. He killed Marek and Vashti, our brothers, our kin." One of the warriors stepped forward, a tracker with particularly intricate white patterns covering his arms, indicating mastery of the hunt. "The signs show they head for the silent peaks," he reported with certainty. "The human knows how to hide his trail, but not perfectly. They traveled through the night, moving quickly." "Why would they go there?" questioned another warrior. "The peaks are forbidden, dangerous, even for us." Enoch's expression darkened further at the confirmation of what he had already suspected. "The exile," he said, the word carrying layers of history and conflict. "My daughter seeks the exile's protection." Murmurs ran through the small group at this revelation. All knew of the exile, the former wise woman who had turned against tradition and been cast out decades ago, yet who still occasionally provided aid to those in the tribe who shared her rebellious views. Her continued existence was an open secret, tolerated only because direct conflict with her might divide the tribe along lines better left undisturbed. "We will not rest," Enoch declared, his voice rising with conviction. "We will not falter or turn aside. My daughter must complete the ritual of first blood, or she cannot take her rightful place among us. Our ways have kept us strong for countless generations. They cannot be cast aside by the whims of a child or the interference of an off-worlder." He looked up at the jagged mountains looming ahead, their peaks partially obscured by the mist that gathered around their upper reaches. The Silent Peaks were aptly named, a place where no birds sang, where no life flourished among the strange metallic formations that some believed were not natural to this world. "The human has chosen to interfere in our ways," Enoch continued, his tone shifting from ceremonial to pragmatic. "For that transgression, his blood will feed the sacred earth. But he is clever and dangerous, as these fallen brothers have discovered. We will proceed with caution and purpose." The warriors nodded in solemn agreement, their expressions reflecting their leader's resolve. This was no longer just about retrieving a wayward child who had fled a sacred ritual. It had evolved into something more significant, a defense of their traditions against outside interference, a matter of honor and vengeance for fallen tribesmen. The human had made himself an enemy of the tribe through his actions. His fate was sealed by tribal law and custom. Dawn found Cyril and Ariadne already moving along the mountain path, having broken camp while the stars were still visible in the gradually lightening sky. Cyril's wounded arm felt substantially better than he had expected. Whatever healing properties Ariadne's blood-stop plant possessed, they were remarkably effective. The bleeding had stopped completely overnight, and the angry red inflammation around the cut had receded to a more normal healing process. There was still pain with movement, but it no longer threatened to incapacitate him. They traveled in tense silence for the most part, conserving energy and breath for the difficult climb ahead. The path grew steadily steeper, winding its way up through increasingly rugged terrain. In places, they had to use hands as well as feet, scrambling up near vertical sections where rock slides had partially obscured the original trail. The physical demands were substantial, but both were driven by the knowledge that stopping meant being overtaken by their pursuers. Ariadne proved impressively agile and sure-footed on the difficult terrain, sometimes finding routes that Cyril's larger human frame couldn't navigate efficiently. When they encountered particularly challenging sections, she moved ahead to scout the best path, then returned to guide him through the obstacles. Despite the danger and urgency of their situation, Cyril found himself genuinely impressed by her adaptability and resilience. This was clearly a child who had been raised in a warrior culture, and it showed in her physical capabilities, if not in her temperament or choices. By midday, they had reached a high plateau that offered a panoramic view of the valley below and the terrain they had traversed. In the far distance, they could see the red forest where they had first met, now seeming tiny and insignificant from this elevation. Closer, winding along the base of the mountains like a silver ribbon, was the river they had followed during the first stage of their journey. The perspective emphasized just how far they had come in a short time, driven by necessity and fear. But the view also revealed something far more immediate and concerning. On the mountain path below them, clearly visible as small blue dots against the gray-brown rock, were at least half a dozen warriors. The hunting party was closer than Cyril had estimated, perhaps only a few hours behind them despite all their efforts to move quickly and cover their trail. "They come faster than expected," Ariadne said, tension evident in her voice as she spotted the pursuers. There was resignation in her tone, as if part of her had always known escape would prove impossible. Cyril nodded grimly, mentally calculating distances and terrain. "We need different path," he concluded. "This main trail too easy to follow, too predictable." He retrieved the map Ariadne had brought, studying it with greater attention than their previous hasty consultations had allowed. According to the crude but effective drawings, they needed to head northeast from their current position to reach the Silent Peaks. The direct route would take them along the main path they were currently following, the same one their pursuers were using. But there appeared to be an alternate route, marked with warning symbols on the map that had suggested danger. "What this?" Cyril asked, pointing to the alternative pathway and its accompanying symbols. Ariadne's expression grew serious, almost fearful. "Wind Canyon," she replied with obvious reluctance. "Very dangerous. Winds so strong, blow people off cliffs. Many die trying to pass." Cyril looked back down at the advancing warriors. then at the narrow side path barely visible among the rocks that would lead them to this wind canyon. It wasn't much of a choice when examined logically. The main path guaranteed capture within hours. The canyon offered at least the possibility of survival, albeit with high risk. We go Wind Canyon, he decided, already gathering their few possessions. Now, no time to waste. They left the plateau, taking the side path that diverged from the main route at a sharp angle. Almost immediately, the terrain became significantly more challenging. The path narrowed to little more than a ledge in places, with a sheer drop on the outer edge that disappeared into mist hundreds of meters below. They moved with extreme caution, Cyril leading the way, occasionally reaching back to help Ariadne navigate particularly dangerous sections where the path had partially crumbled away. As they progressed deeper into the winding canyon, the wind began to pick up noticeably. At first, it was just a steady breeze that tugged at their clothing, but soon it strengthened into powerful gusts that physically buffeted them against the canyon wall. Cyril now understood with visceral clarity why this place was called Wind Canyon. The unique geography created a natural wind tunnel, channeling and amplifying the air currents that flowed through the mountains until they reached near cyclonic force at certain points. "Hold on to me," Cyril instructed, stopping at a relatively sheltered section to retrieve a length of cord from his pack. He tied one end securely around his waist, and then the other around Ariadne's, creating a physical connection between them. "If fall, I catch. If I fall, brace against rock, hold cord." The small girl nodded solemnly, her white hair whipping wildly around her face in the strengthening wind. The seriousness with which she regarded their situation belied her age. There was no childish panic or complaint, only the focused determination to survive that Cyril recognized from his own experiences. They continued forward, now physically linked by the cord, pressing themselves against the canyon wall as much as possible to minimize their exposure to the increasingly violent gusts. The wind grew stronger with each step, howling through the canyon with an almost sentient fury that sent shivers down Cyril's spine despite his usual stoicism. The sound became overwhelming, a constant roar that made communication virtually impossible. They shifted to a system of hand signals and gestures, moving forward when the wind momentarily abated, clinging desperately to the rock face when it raged at its strongest. Progress became agonizingly slow, each meter gained representing a significant victory against the elements. What might have taken an hour on the main path was consuming most of the afternoon. The physical strain was immense, constantly fighting against the wind's pressure, maintaining balance on the narrow ledge, helping each other through particularly exposed sections where the path offered minimal protection. Cyril's wounded arm protested with each movement, the pain returning as the physical demands on his body increased. At a particularly treacherous section where the path narrowed to barely the width of a human foot, a sudden violent gust caught Ariadne unprepared. Despite her agility and careful movement, the force of the wind simply overcame her smaller mass. She lost her footing and was swept off the path with frightening suddenness, the wind lifting her small body as if she weighed nothing at all. Cyril felt the jerk on the cord connecting them and braced himself against the canyon wall, his wounded arm screaming in protest at the sudden strain as Ariadne's full weight transferred through the rope. For a terrifying moment, she dangled over the abyss, held only by the cord and Cyril's desperate grip on a small outcropping of rock. The wind continued to buffet her suspended form, threatening to tear both of them from the precarious safety of the ledge. Then, with a strength born of absolute necessity, Cyril pulled her back toward the path, fighting against both gravity and the raging wind. Ariadne wasn't passive in her rescue. She struggled against the elements, her small hands reaching for any purchase they could find, her feet kicking against the smooth stone until she managed to find a tiny foothold. Together, through sheer determination and refusal to surrender to the deadly forces arrayed against them, they managed to get her back onto the narrow ledge. They paused there, both breathing heavily, Ariadne trembling visibly from the near-death experience. Cyril checked the knots in the cord, ensuring they were still secure, then examined the path ahead as best he could through the swirling dust and debris carried by the wind. There was no option but to continue forward. Returning would only lead them back to their pursuers. With a nod to each other that conveyed more than words could have in the howling maelstrom, they pressed on, now moving with even greater caution, staying lower to the ground when possible, using handholds in the rock to maintain stability against the unpredictable gusts. By the time they emerged from the far end of Wind Canyon into a relatively sheltered valley, dusk was falling. They were physically exhausted, their muscles aching from the constant tension and strain of fighting the wind for hours. But they had gained a significant tactical advantage. Their pursuers, following the main path, would either have to attempt Wind Canyon themselves, losing precious time in the process, or take an even longer road around the mountains. Either choice would give Cyril and Ariadne valuable additional hours. They made camp in a small cave just beyond the canyon's exit, finally allowing themselves the luxury of a small, controlled fire. The night air at this elevation was bitterly cold, dropping well below freezing, and they needed warmth more than they needed absolute stealth now. The cave's configuration allowed the smoke to disperse through natural fissures in the rock, minimizing the visible signature of their presence. As they huddled near the flames, sharing a meager meal of dried meat and the last of Cyril's travel rations, Ariadne looked up at him with an expression of curious intensity in her violet eyes. "Why you help me?" she asked directly. "Dangerous for you? No. Benefit. Could live peaceful without me." The question caught Cyril by surprise, though it was one he had asked himself repeatedly since their paths had crossed. It was a fair and logical question, one that deserved an honest answer if he could formulate one that bridged their different languages and experiences. He was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire as he considered his response. Why indeed had he risked his carefully constructed survival for an alien child? Why oppose a culture he had studiously avoided for 3 years of successful isolation? "Long time alone," he finally answered, his voice rough from the day's exertions and general disuse. "See you afraid. Remember, being afraid. After ship crash. No one helped me then. Everyone dead or gone." He paused, struggling to articulate complex emotions with his limited vocabulary and rusty social skills. Maybe tired of just surviving, not living. Help you feels like living again. It wasn't the complete truth. No simple explanation could encompass the complex web of motivations that had driven his decision. The echo of his own past trauma in her situation, the simple human need for connection after years of isolation, the visceral rejection of what her people had tried to force her to become, all of it too nuanced to express in his limited, shared vocabulary with her. Ariadne seemed to understand something of what remained unspoken. She nodded solemnly, her expression suggesting comprehension beyond her years. "Could you help?" she said with surprising gentleness. "Thank you. Not many would risk for stranger, for not same kind." They lapsed into companionable silence again, the crackling of the fire the only sound in their small sanctuary. After a while, Ariadne spoke again, her tone shifted to something more pragmatic and concerned. "Father very angry now," she said, poking at the fire with the small stick. "You kill his best hunters. Marek and Vashti, strong warriors, much respected. This, personal now." "Personal?" Cyril questioned, seeking clarification. "Not just me anymore," she elaborated, her vocabulary and his language clearly expanding through their continued interaction. "Before, just bring me back for ritual. Now you his enemy, blood debt, tribal honor wounded." Cyril nodded grimly, having suspected as much based on what he had observed of their culture from a distance. By helping Ariadne and killing her pursuers, he had elevated himself from an incidental obstacle to a direct enemy of her people. Even if they reached the Silent Peaks and found sanctuary for Ariadne, he would still have to deal with the long-term consequences of his actions. The indigenous people had long memories and strong traditions of vengeance based on the hunting behavior he had observed. "I handle it," he said with more confidence than he truly felt, not wanting to burden the child with his concerns. "Sleep now. Tomorrow, reach Silent Peaks. Find Old One." Ariadne curled up near the fire, using Cyril's pack as a pillow, her small form seeming especially vulnerable in the flickering light. Despite everything they had been through, sleep came quickly to her. The deep, restorative sleep of the young, whose bodies prioritize healing and growth even in adverse circumstances. Cyril remained awake considerably longer, maintaining watch and contemplating what lay ahead. According to the map, they were close to the Silent Peaks now. By midday tomorrow, they should reach their destination, assuming no further complications arose. What they would find there, whether this exile would actually be able or willing to help Ariadne, remained to be seen. But they had come too far and risked too much to turn back now. Cyril added more fuel to the small fire, then settled into a light, vigilant doze, his senses still partially alert for any sign of danger. Tomorrow would bring the final leg of their journey, and quite possibly a final confrontation with Ariadne's father and his warriors. The morning dawned clear and cold, a crystalline quality to the air that suggested they had reached an elevation where the atmosphere was noticeably thinner. From their elevated position, Cyril and Ariadne could see for kilometers across the rugged landscape they had traversed. The silent peaks loomed ahead, now clearly visible as their primary destination, a cluster of sharp, blade-like mountains that seemed to pierce the sky itself. Even at this distance, Cyril could see that they were unlike the other mountains they had passed. Their surface appeared smoother, more uniform, almost metallic in appearance, reflecting the early sunlight like dull mirrors or the blade of an ancient weapon. "Why called Silent Peaks?" Cyril asked as they gathered their few possessions and prepared to depart, his curiosity piqued by the unusual appearance of their destination. "No birds there," Ariadne replied, her gaze fixed on the strange mountains with a mixture of apprehension and hope. "No animals, no insects, nothing lives there. Too sharp, too strange, and—" She hesitated, searching for the right words to express a concept that might be tied to cultural beliefs rather than objective reality. "People say, spirits there steal voice, go silent forever if speak wrong words." Cyril raised a skeptical eyebrow at this last part. "You believe?" we asked, wondering how much of her culture's superstitions the child accepted as literal truth. Ariadne shrugged, a surprisingly human gesture that suggested a pragmatic approach to inherited beliefs. "Old stories, maybe true, maybe not. But exile lived there many years. She not silent. She speak whenever wants." This practical assessment increased Cyril's respect for the girl's intelligence. Despite her youth and the cultural indoctrination she must have received, she maintained a capacity for independent thought that had ultimately led to her rejection of the blood ritual and subsequent flight. They set off following a path that grew increasingly difficult to discern as they approached the Silent Peaks. What had been a reasonably clear trail became a series of navigable gaps between sheer rock faces, requiring careful route finding and occasional climbing. The terrain changed noticeably as they drew closer to their destination. The gray-brown stone of the regular mountains gave way gradually to a darker, almost metallic-looking rock that had a different texture and sound underfoot. The sparse vegetation that had clung tenaciously to life at this elevation disappeared entirely, leaving a starkly barren landscape. By mid-morning, they had reached what could properly be considered the outer boundary of the Silent Peaks themselves. Cyril understood immediately why they had earned their name. The usual ambient sounds of the mountains, the distant cry of flying predators, the rustle of wind through sparse vegetation, the occasional fall of loose stone, were completely absent here. A profound, almost unnatural silence enveloped them, broken only by the sound of their own breathing and footsteps, which seemed unnaturally loud in the perfect stillness. The peaks themselves were unlike anything Cyril had encountered before on this world or Earth. They rose from the ground like massive blades or shards of some unimaginably large broken object, their edges literally sharp enough to cut flesh on contact. The surfaces were smooth and dark, with an almost obsidian-like quality, yet they reflected light differently than any natural stone Cyril had ever seen. Strange geometric patterns were visible across their surfaces when the light hit them at certain angles, regular, repeating designs that seemed too precise to be natural formations. "These not natural," Cyril observed, running a cautious finger along one of the smaller formations. The edge was sharp enough to slice through skin with minimal pressure, and he withdrew his hand quickly before he could injure himself. "Not made by nature." "Older than people," Ariadne agreed, regarding the formations with the appropriate respect of someone raised with cultural warnings about their nature. "Stories say, from before stars, from before world." The implication was clear, though neither of them articulated it directly. These structures were artifacts, not natural formations, the remnants of something constructed by intelligence, whether ancient indigenous civilization or something even more removed from their current experience. The revelation added another layer of mystery to their journey and destination. They picked their way carefully through this landscape of knife-like protrusions, the danger of serious injury adding to the already considerable challenges they faced. In places, the blades formed natural labyrinths, forcing them to backtrack and find new routes when passages narrowed beyond usability. The map helped, but it was crude at best, and the alien geometry of the silent peaks made navigation challenging even with guidance. As they ventured deeper into this strange environment, Cyril began to understand the superstitious fear the indigenous people maintained toward this place. There was something inherently unsettling about it, not just the unnatural silence or the deadly sharp formations, but a subtle wrongness that defied easy description. It felt ancient in a way that transcended normal concepts of time, as if they walked among the bones of something that had existed when the planet itself was young. "Where Exile live?" he asked Ariadna, keeping his voice low despite the absence of any immediate threat, the oppressive silence making normal volume seem somehow disrespectful or dangerous. Ariadna pointed to a particularly large formation ahead, a massive blade-like peak that rose significantly higher than those surrounding it. "Under Big One," she said with certainty. "Cave where blade meets ground. Hidden entrance." They continued forward, their progress slowed considerably by the need to navigate safely through the treacherous terrain. Each step required careful consideration. One slip could result in a severe or potentially fatal injury on the razor-sharp edges surrounding them. The sun reached its zenith and began its afternoon descent as they worked their way deeper into the silent peaks. The shadows cast by the towering formations creating a disorienting pattern of light and darkness across their path. By early afternoon, they had reached the base of the massive peak Ariadna had indicated. As she had described, where the great blade met the ground, there was an opening, a fissure just wide enough for a person to slip through sideways. It looked less like a natural cave entrance and more like a deliberate crack in the otherwise seamless surface of the structure. Cyril paused at the entrance, suddenly hesitant to proceed into the unknown. "Exile expects us?" he asked, wondering if they might be walking into danger despite their long journey. Ariadna shook her head. No one tell her, but she knows things. Without telling, sees things before it happens sometimes. She tapped her temple. Special mind. Why tribe feared her? Why they exile her? This wasn't particularly reassuring information, suggesting they might be seeking help from someone unpredictable or potentially unstable. But they had come too far to turn back now, and their options were severely limited by the pursuit behind them. Cyril gestured for Ariadna to stay behind him, then carefully entered the fissure, his hand on his knife, senses alert for any sign of danger. The interior was surprisingly spacious once they had navigated the narrow entrance. The crack widened into a proper cavern, illuminated by strange phosphorescent fungi that grew in patches along the walls. The light they produced was soft and blue-white, giving the space an otherworldly glow that enhanced the alien quality of their surroundings. The cavern showed clear signs of long-term habitation. Simple furniture fashioned from the same metallic-looking material as the peaks outside. Storage containers made from woven fibers, similar to those used in Ariadna's clothing. A fire pit in the center with a clever system of vents and channels to direct smoke out through unseen exits in the ceiling. Tools hung from the walls, some recognizable in purpose, others completely mysterious to Cyril's human perspective. But there was no sign of the exile herself, no indication that anyone was currently present despite the evidence of recent occupation. The fire pit still contained warm embers, suggesting it had been used within the past few hours. "Hello?" Ariadna called out, her voice echoing strangely in the space, the acoustics unlike anything Cyril had experienced. "Old One? It is Ariadna. Ariadna, daughter of Enoch. I seek sanctuary." Silence answered them, the cavern seemingly empty despite the evidence of habitation. Cyril moved further into the space, alert for any movement or sound that might indicate presence or threat. The place felt recently occupied but temporarily abandoned, as if the inhabitant had stepped out briefly, perhaps to gather supplies or attend to some task outside. A sudden noise from outside the cave made both of them freeze in place. Cyril moved quickly back to the entrance and peered out through the narrow fissure, his body tensing with anticipation of conflict. What he saw made his blood run cold with the certainty of imminent confrontation. Standing on a relatively flat area about 50 meters from the cave entrance was a tall, imposing figure, blue-skinned, adorned with white markings that were more elaborate and extensive than any Cyril had seen on the warriors they had encountered previously. The patterns clearly denoted high rank or status within their society. He held a massive ceremonial spear, its blade gleaming ominously in the harsh sunlight. the shaft adorned with what appeared to be small tokens or trophies from past victories. Around him, the silent peaks created a natural arena, their blade-like formations forming a rough circle around the flat space. Enoch had found them, and more disturbingly, he had come alone, suggesting either supreme confidence in his abilities or a desire to handle this matter personally, without witnesses. Cyril turned back to Ariadne, whose violet eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and resignation. "Father," she whispered, the single word carrying a complex weight of emotion, fear, respect, disappointment, and a child's natural longing for parental approval despite everything that had transpired. "Stay here," Cyril instructed her firmly, his decision made instantly. "Hide. I talked to him." "No!" Ariadne grabbed his arm with surprising strength, genuine panic in her voice. "He kill you, best warrior in tribe. Many victories, no mercy for enemies." "Have to try," Cyril replied, gently but firmly removing her hand from his arm. "Find exile. She come, she help. If I not return." He paused, recognizing the gravity of what he was suggesting. "You stay with her, learn her ways, survive." Before Ariadne could protest further, Cyril slipped back through the fissure and out onto the flat, open area where Enoch waited with predatory patience. He approached cautiously, his weapons sheathed but within easy reach, maintaining a posture that balanced readiness with an appearance of non-aggression. He stopped about 10 meters from Enoch, close enough for conversation, but far enough to give him some reaction time if the warrior attacked without warning. Enoch regarded him with cold, calculating eyes that reminded Cyril unnervingly of Ariadne's, the same violet hue but lacking the warmth and expressiveness of his daughter's gaze. Up close, the indigenous leader was even more intimidating than he had appeared at a distance. He stood nearly a head taller than Cyril, his body powerful and heavily muscled beneath the minimal armor he wore. The white markings that decorated his blue skin formed intricate patterns that seemed to tell a story of battle and leadership, each line and curve representing some achievement or status within his culture. "You take my daughter," Enoch said in the human language, his pronunciation surprisingly precise, despite the natural differences in vocal structure between their species. "You kill my warriors. You interfere in sacred matters that not concern you." The warrior's command of human language was unexpected, suggesting significantly more interaction with the colonists than Cyril had realized occurred. This wasn't the broken, halting communication he had established with Ariadne, but a fluent, if somewhat formal, grasp of his language. The revelation raised new questions about the relationship between humans and the indigenous population before the colony ship disaster. "Your daughter ran from you," Cyril replied evenly, deliberately keeping emotion from his voice. "She chose her path. I helped one who asked for help. Nothing more." Enoch's expression darkened, the white markings on his face seeming to stand out more prominently against his blue skin as his emotions intensified. "She is child," he countered with barely controlled anger. "Not understand the importance of ritual. Too young to make such choice. You interfere in what you not understand." "I understand enough," Cyril responded, allowing some of his own moral outrage to surface. "Child forced to kill, drink blood, become like you. That is not choice. That is coercion." "Become strong," Enoch corrected sharply, his grip tightening visibly on his ceremonial spear. "Survive this world. You think kindness keep her alive? Weakness is death here. Always has been. Always will be." There was something unexpected in Enoch's tone, not just anger or wounded authority, but a deeper emotion that Cyril recognized from his own experiences. Concern, fear for a child's safety in a dangerous world. The warrior truly believed he was acting in Ariadne's best interest, that the brutal ritual was necessary preparation for survival in an unforgiving reality. Different strength, Cyril argued, seeing an opportunity to connect rather than simply oppose. Not just killing, thinking, choosing, adapting. She choose different path, show strength in that choice. Enoch shook his head dismissively, though something in his eyes suggested the words had registered on some level. She returned to tribe, complete ritual. No choice in this matter. Our ways older than memory. Keep us alive when thousand dangers threaten. Cannot be changed for comfort or conscience. Always choice, Cyril insisted, standing his ground despite the overwhelming physical threat Enoch represented. Even in harshest world, Choice defines us, makes us more than animals. For a long moment, the two men, human and alien, stared at each other across the intervening space, each taking the measure of the other, each recognizing something familiar in the opposition. Then, with deliberate slowness that carried unmistakable menace, Enoch lowered his ceremonial spear to a combat position. "You stand between father and daughter," he said, his voice flat and implacable. "This end now." Cyril understood with perfect clarity. There would be no reasoning, no negotiation, no peaceful resolution. Enoch had come for his daughter, and he would not leave without her. The only way to prevent that was to defeat him, an outcome that seemed virtually impossible given the warrior's clear physical advantages and what must be decades of combat experience. Still, Cyril had survived on this hostile world for 3 years by doing what seemed impossible on a regular basis. He drew his hunting knife with his right hand and unsheathed a smaller throwing knife with his left, mentally calculating distances and angles, searching for any potential advantage in the terrain or circumstances. "Your choice," he said to Enoch, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "But I not step aside while child forced to kill against her will." What followed was less a duel between equals and more a brutal lesson in the difference between human and indigenous physical capabilities. Enoch moved with a speed that belied his size, covering the distance between them in what seemed like a single fluid motion. His spear thrust forward with deadly precision, aimed directly at Cyril's chest with enough force to impale him completely. Cyril barely managed to dodge, the spear's blade slicing through the air where he had stood a fraction of a second earlier. He countered with a throw of his smaller knife, aiming for Enoch's shoulder, a non-lethal target, but one that might slow the warrior down and provide some tactical advantage. The knife struck true, embedding itself in the blue flesh where neck met shoulder, but to Cyril's dismay, it barely seemed to register with his opponent. The blade penetrated only minimally, as if striking something much denser than human flesh. Enoch reached up with his free hand and plucked it out with no more reaction than if it had been a minor annoyance, tossing it aside with casual disdain. Cyril backpedaled rapidly, trying to maintain distance and reassess his approach. But Enoch pressed his advantage relentlessly. The spear came at him again and again, each thrust forcing Cyril to give ground. The warrior's technique was flawless, the product of lifelong training and practical combat experience. He was being systematically driven back toward the razor-sharp formations that surrounded the arena-like space, his options diminishing with each retreating step. In desperation, Cyril tried to circle around, attempting to use his smaller size and potentially greater agility to his advantage. He feinted to the left, then darted right, slashing at Enoch's leg as he passed within striking distance. His knife connected, drawing a line of dark purple blood across the blue skin. But the wound seemed to only fuel Enoch's determination. The warrior roared, a sound unlike anything Cyril had heard from a human throat, primal and terrifying, and swung the butt of his spear in a wide arc. It caught Cyril in the ribs with devastating force, lifting him off his feet and sending him sprawling across the rocky ground. Pain exploded through Cyril's torso. One or more ribs were cracked, if not broken outright, sending waves of agony through his chest with each breath. He rolled desperately to avoid the follow-up thrust of Enoch's spear, the blade striking sparks from the metallic ground where it impacted with enough force to have skewered him completely. Cyril scrambled to his feet, his breathing labored and painful, his sides screaming in protest at each movement. He still gripped his hunting knife, but it seemed pathetically inadequate against Enoch's reach, strength, and natural armor. The battle was hopelessly mismatched, and both combatants knew it. This wasn't a contest, but an execution delayed only by Cyril's desperate scrambling. Enoch advanced methodically now, sensing inevitable victory. His violet eyes, so like his daughter's in color, but utterly different in expression, showed no mercy, no hesitation. He had come to reclaim Ariadne and eliminate the human who had interfered in tribal matters. He would accomplish both objectives with the same implacable efficiency he brought to all aspects of his role as war chief. Cyril's back hit something solid, one of the blade-like formations that surrounded the arena. He was trapped, with nowhere left to retreat. Enoch approached, spear raised for the killing blow, his face set in lines of grim finality. "You fight well," the warrior acknowledged, with what appeared to be genuine respect. "For human." Cyril tensed, preparing for one final, desperate move, though he had no illusions about its likely success against an opponent who had consistently outmatched him in every aspect of combat. Before he could act, however, a small figure darted out from the fissure in the central peak, moving with surprising speed across the open ground. "No!" Ariadne cried, her young voice carrying clearly in the unnatural silence of the peaks. She planted herself directly between her father and Cyril, her arms outstretched as if to physically block the killing blow. In her hand, she clutched the obsidian ritual dagger, its black blade catching the sunlight with an ominous gleam. Enoch paused, his spear still raised, but his attention now fixed on his daughter. Surprise flickered across his stern features, followed by something that might have been concern. "Move aside," he commanded in their native language, the words incomprehensible to Cyril, but their meaning clear from context. "This ends now." "Yes," Ariadne replied, also switching to their language as she faced her father. "It ends." To Cyril's horror and incomprehension, she raised the ritual dagger, not toward her father in threat, but toward her own chest. Her small hands gripped the hilt with terrible determination, the blade hovering just above her heart. "I will not become what you want me to be," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that began to stream down her blue cheeks. "I will not kill for your traditions. I will not drink blood to prove my worth. I would rather die free than live as a murderer." The meaning of her words became clear to Cyril through her actions, even though he couldn't understand most of the specific language. She was threatening suicide rather than submission, choosing death over the path her father demanded she walk. The realization sent a cold wave of shock through him, momentarily displacing even the pain of his injuries. Enoch's expression changed dramatically. Shock, confusion, and something else. Something more vulnerable crossing his fierce features. "Ariadne," he said, his tone different now, almost pleading. "Do not do this foolish thing." "Why not?" she demanded, the ritual dagger trembling slightly in her grip, but remaining pointed toward herself. "Is this not strength? Is this not choosing my own path, even if that path leads to death? You taught me that strength means making hard choices. This is my choice." The ritual dagger wavered in her small hands, its obsidian blade catching the harsh sunlight. The moment stretched with unbearable tension, the three figures frozen in a tableau of conflicting wills and principles. Then slowly Enoch lowered his spear. His eyes, so cold and implacable before, now held a different emotion as they studied his daughter's face. He was seeing her, really seeing her, perhaps for the first time, not as a child to be molded into a warrior in his image, but as an individual with her own will, her own strength, her own concept of honor that might differ from his, yet remain valid. "This is not what I wanted," he said finally, his voice rougher than before, carrying the weight of realization. "The ritual is to make you strong, to prepare you for this world's dangers, to ensure you survive when I no longer can protect you." "There are different kinds of strength," Ariadne replied, echoing Cyril's earlier words, but giving them new depth and meaning from her own perspective. "The strength to kill when necessary, yes, but also the strength to refuse to kill when it would be easier to obey. The strength to walk a new path when the old one leads to darkness." Enoch was silent for a long moment, his internal struggle visible in the play of emotions across his normally controlled features. The ritual he sought to enforce was clearly central to his culture, a tradition passed down through countless generations. To acknowledge its potential wrongness, or at least its unsuitability for his daughter, represented a profound challenge to his entire worldview. Then, to Cyril's astonishment, Enoch deliberately planted the butt of his spear in the ground and took a step backward, a gesture of temporary truce. It wasn't surrender or agreement, but it was acknowledgement, a willingness to listen that hadn't been present before. "Perhaps," he began, then paused, as if the words were physically difficult to form. "Perhaps there is wisdom in what you say. The world changes. Our ways, perhaps they too must change, or we become prisoners of tradition rather than its guardians." Ariadne lowered the ritual dagger, though she did not put it away completely. "I will not come back to complete the ritual," she said with quiet firmness. "I cannot. That path is closed to me now." Enoch nodded slowly, acceptance gradually replacing resistance in his bearing. "Then you have chosen exile, like the old one before you." "Where is the old one?" Ariadne asked, looking around as if only now remembering the original purpose of their dangerous journey to the Silent Peaks. We came seeking her guidance and protection. A new voice answered, female, aged but strong, with a musical quality that seemed to resonate with the strange acoustics of the Silent Peaks. I am here. I have always been here, watching and waiting. From behind one of the blade-like formations stepped an elderly indigenous woman. Her skin was the same blue as Ariadne's and Enoch's, but paler with age and time spent away from direct sunlight. White hair, much like Ariadne's, hung in long braids adorned with small metallic objects that clinked softly as she moved, creating delicate music in the previous silence. Her violet eyes were clear and keen despite her apparent age, taking in the scene before her with evident understanding of its significance. I watched, she said, moving to stand beside Ariadne, with a protective gesture that seemed both instinctive and calculated. I waited to see what would unfold, to see what choices would be made when the moment of truth arrived. Enoch straightened at her appearance, a gesture of respect that appeared automatic even in these extraordinary circumstances. Elder Mara, he acknowledged, using a title that suggested her former position within the tribe despite her current exile. You live. Despite the tribe's best efforts to forget me, yes, she replied, with a hint of dry humor that suggested a complex personality shaped by long isolation and independent thought. And now another comes to join me in exile, another who questions what should not be questioned, who thinks what should not be thought. She placed a gnarled hand on Ariadne's shoulder in a gesture of acceptance and protection. A child who shows wisdom beyond her years and courage beyond her size. A worthy successor, perhaps, to carry knowledge that the tribe rejects in its warrior pride. Enoch seemed conflicted, his gaze moving from Mara to his daughter to Cyril, who still stood with his back against the blade formation, wounded but alert, following the interaction with intense concentration, despite not understanding much of the language. The human, Enoch said finally, switching back to the language Cyril could understand. He interfered in tribal matters where he had no right or place. He protected a child from harm, Mara corrected, also speaking in the human language with surprising fluency. Is that not also a warrior's duty, to shield those who cannot shield themselves? Or has the tribe forgotten that strength without compassion is merely brutality, dressed in honor's clothing? She is my daughter, Enoch insisted, a father's possessive protection evident beneath his warrior's exterior. My responsibility. And you would have forced her to commit an act that would have scarred her spirit, Mara replied, her tone hardening with conviction, born of long contemplation. The ritual of first blood has its place, Enoch, but not all are meant to walk the warrior's path. Some must walk other paths, paths of healing, of wisdom, of bringing peoples together rather than driving them apart. She gestured toward Ariadne, who stood straighter under the old woman's approving gaze. Look at her. Really look with a father's eyes rather than a war chief's. Do you see a future war chief? Or do you see something else? Something perhaps more valuable to the tribe in these changing times? A bridge builder? A healer? A thinker? Enoch stared at his daughter as if seeing her anew, his gaze lingering on the details of her face, her stance, her expression. Ariadne met his gaze steadily, no longer cowering or afraid but standing with quiet dignity despite her youth. In that moment of silent communication between father and daughter, something fundamental shifted, a recognition of truth that transcended cultural conditioning and expectation. Finally, Enoch sighed deeply, a sound that seemed to release years of rigid adherence to tradition and unchallenged assumptions. What would you have me do? He asked Mara. The tribe expects her return, expects the ritual to be completed. The priests have already prepared the ceremonial ground. Tell them she has chosen a different initiation, Mara suggested, her tone softening as she sensed his gradual acceptance. The path of the wise one, as I once did. Tell them she will stay with me, learn the old ways, not just of war, but of healing, of knowledge, of understanding the world beyond our immediate experience. She glanced at Cyril, including him in her assessment and plan. Including understanding those who came from beyond the stars. The future may depend more on such understanding than on how many warriors we can field, or how much blood we can spill. Enoch considered this proposal, his expression troubled but thoughtful. The council of elders will not be pleased. The priests will speak of sacrilege and broken tradition. The council rarely is pleased by anything that challenges their authority. Mara replied with a smile that suggested old conflicts and perhaps old wounds. But they adapt, in time, as must we all. The universe does not stand still for our convenience or to accommodate our certainties. For a long moment, Enoch remained silent, the internal struggle evident in his posture and expression. Then, with deliberate movements that carried ritual significance, he withdrew his ceremonial spear from where he had planted it in the ground and held it vertically before him in what appeared to be a formal gesture of conclusion. "I will tell them," he said finally, his decision made. "But know this, exile. If any harm comes to her while in your care, not even these silent peaks will hide you from me." Father's oath. Mara nodded solemnly, accepting the terms and the implied threat with equanimity. She will be safe, and she will grow strong in her own way, not as a mirror of others' expectations. Enoch turned his attention to Cyril, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, understanding fragments, but following the emotional current clearly enough. "And the human? He killed my warriors. Their blood calls for answer." "In defense of the child," Mara pointed out reasonably, "as would any of your warriors if roles were reversed. Is not defending the young the most sacred duty? You would have done the same, Enoch, had you found a human child threatened by her own people." Enoch's expression remained hard, but after a moment of internal deliberation, he gave a curt nod. "Blood has been spilled on both sides," he acknowledged. "Let it end here, in this place of ancient power. No more hunting, no more death, if the human agrees." He approached Cyril, stopping just out of arm's reach, his imposing presence a reminder of the physical danger he still represented. "You fought well," he acknowledged, a warrior's respect evident beneath the lingering hostility. "For my daughter's sake, I grant you peace between us, but do not cross my path again, human. This mercy comes once only." Cyril straightened despite the pain in his ribs, meeting Enoch's gaze directly. There was no point in pretense or posturing. They both knew the outcome had their combat continued. But there was value in dignity and honesty, even in defeat. "Peace accepted," he replied simply. "No more blood between us." Enoch turned back to Ariadne, and for a brief moment, his fierce demeanor softened visibly. He reached out a hand as if to touch her face in a gesture of paternal affection, then hesitated and withdrew it, cultural restraint reasserting itself even in this emotional moment. "You are brave," he told her, genuine pride evident beneath the formal tone. "Perhaps braver than I understood or wished to see. Learn well from the old one. Grow strong in your own way. Perhaps one day you will return to us, not as a warrior, but as something else our tribe needs." Tears welled in Ariadne's violet eyes, but she blinked them back with evident effort, standing straight as she faced her father. "I will make you proud, father," she promised, "just not in the way you expected. I will find my own path, my own strength." Enoch nodded once, a gesture of acceptance if not full understanding, then turned and strode away, his tall figure soon lost among the blade-like formations of the silent peaks. The confrontation was over. The immediate danger passed, though its implications would likely continue to reverberate for all involved. Mara moved to Cyril's side as soon as Enoch had departed, examining his injuries with the practiced eye of one experienced in healing arts. "Broken ribs," she diagnosed with professional detachment. 2, perhaps 3, and that arm wound needs proper treatment to prevent infection. "Come, both of you. My dwelling is more comfortable than it appears from outside, and I have medicines for pain and healing." As they made their way back to the fissure in the central peak, Ariadne slipped her small hand into Cyril's larger one. "Thank you," she said simply, the words inadequate for the life-changing intervention he had made, but offered with genuine emotion. "For everything." Cyril squeezed her hand gently, feeling an unfamiliar warmth spread through him despite the pain of his injuries. "You saved me," he pointed out with equal simplicity. "Your courage, your choice." She smiled up at him, a genuine smile that transformed her alien features into something beautiful and familiar. The universal expression of a child who has found acceptance and a path forward that aligns with her true nature rather than others' expectations. Mara led them into her cave dwelling, which proved to be more extensive and comfortable than their initial glimpse had suggested. The main cavern opened into several smaller chambers, all illuminated by the strange phosphorescent fungi. One chamber contained healing supplies, plants, minerals, and implements, both familiar and alien to Cyril's eyes. Another held what appeared to be a library of sorts, shelves carved directly into the stone walls, holding various artifacts, scrolls, and objects whose purpose he couldn't begin to guess. As Mara treated Cyril's wounds with skilled efficiency, applying poultices and binding his ribs with strips of a flexible, fabric-like material that provided support without restricting breathing, she spoke of her own history. Like Ariadne, she had rejected the tribe's increasingly martial traditions in her youth, choosing instead to pursue knowledge and healing. Her exile had been voluntary at first, a withdrawal to study and think without interference, then made permanent by tribal decree when she refused to return and participate in certain rituals she considered unnecessarily cruel or restrictive. "But they still come to me," she said with a hint of satisfaction as she finished treating Cyril's arm wound. "When their warriors are wounded beyond their healer's skills, when strange illnesses strike, when answers are needed that their traditions cannot provide. They will never admit it openly, but they need those of us who walk different paths." She glanced at Ariadne, who was sorting healing herbs under her direction, already falling into the role of apprentice with natural aptitude. "And now I have an assistant, the first in many years, perhaps the most promising I have seen." She learned quickly, Cyril confirmed, watching the interaction between the elderly mentor and the young child. There was already a visible connection forming, a passing of knowledge that transcended their significant age difference. Mara nodded agreement. The mind that questions is the mind that grows. She questioned what others accepted without thought. That is the beginning of wisdom, regardless of age. Ariana looked up from her task, a question forming. "You will stay?" she asked Cyril directly. "Here with us?" Cyril hesitated, caught off guard by the question and the implied invitation. He glanced at Mara, uncertain of his welcome in what was clearly her established territory. The old woman smiled, correctly interpreting his hesitation. "The Silent Peaks welcome those who come in peace," she said with formal hospitality. "And I would not separate her from one who has shown such loyalty and courage on her behalf. There is space enough, and your knowledge of the world beyond these mountains could be valuable." "I visit," Cyril promised, touched by the offer, but aware of practical considerations. "When wounds heal, bring supplies, things you need from forest. But have camp, traps that need tending." Ariana's face fell slightly with disappointment, but she nodded understanding. "Visit often?" she asked hopefully. "Teach me more human words?" "Yes," he agreed readily. "And you teach me your language better. Much to learn from each other." As night fell, they shared a meal in Mara's cave, the atmosphere surprisingly peaceful given the events of the day. The food was simple but nourishing, wild plants prepared with knowledge of their medicinal as well as nutritional properties, preserved proteins that tasted strange but satisfying to Cyril's human palate. Ariadne seemed to blossom in this new environment, asking questions, absorbing knowledge, her earlier fear and trauma gradually replaced by curiosity and enthusiasm for the path that had unexpectedly opened before her. When it was time to sleep, Mara showed Cyril to a small chamber where he could rest without aggravating his injuries. His ribs ached despite her treatments, but the pain was bearable now and the risk of infection in his arm wound seemed significantly reduced. Before leaving him to his rest, Ariadne approached, something clutched in her small blue hand. "For you," she said solemnly, offering it to him with ceremonial gravity. It was the obsidian ritual dagger, the same one she had threatened to turn on herself earlier that day. The blade still retained its lethal sharpness, though Mara had helped her clean the dried blood from its surface. Cyril frowned in confusion, not understanding the significance of the gift. "Why give me this?" he asked. "Reminder," she explained, her expression serious beyond her years. "Choices always exist, even when seem impossible. When everything dark, remember this. Remember today." Cyril accepted the gift with appropriate solemnity, recognizing the deep meaning it held for her. "I keep safe," he promised. "Remember today. Remember you. Your courage." Satisfied, she left him to his rest, following Mara to another chamber where she would begin her new life as the old one's apprentice. The transition from hunted fugitive to student of ancient wisdom had happened with remarkable speed, but such was the nature of fate and choice on this unpredictable world. Alone, Cyril examined the obsidian blade with greater attention. Its edge still held a lethal sharpness, and the craftsmanship was undeniably beautiful. The handle inlaid with what he now recognized as symbols representing aspects of their culture and cosmology. But its significance transcended its physical properties. It represented a moment of profound choice, Ariadne's willingness to die rather than become something contrary to her nature. That kind of courage was rare in humans or aliens, adults or children. He carefully wrapped the dagger in a piece of leather and placed it in his pack. Tomorrow, once his strength had returned sufficiently, he would begin the journey back to his camp in the foothills. His ribs would make travel slow and painful, but he had survived worse injuries in his 3 years of isolation. Mara had provided medicines that would help with pain and healing, a gesture of trust and gratitude for his protection of Ariadne. And he would return to the Silent Peaks as promised. Perhaps not often, but regularly enough to watch Ariadne grow, to bring supplies that Mara might need, to maintain the unexpected connection he had formed with these strange blue-skinned people who were, in ways that transcended physical differences, not so different from humans after all. As he drifted towards sleep, lulled by the strange harmony of the Silent Peaks, Cyril reflected on the chain of events that had brought him to this moment. 3 years of isolation, of talking to no one, of fighting only for his own survival without purpose beyond continued existence. Then, in the space of a few days, everything had changed, all because he had chosen to help a frightened child caught in his trap. The world remained harsh and unforgiving. Survival was still a daily challenge, but something had shifted within him, a change as significant as any external circumstance. The cynical shell he had built around himself since the colony ship disaster had cracked, revealing something he had thought lost forever: the capacity for connection, for compassion, for seeing beyond immediate self-interest to a larger purpose. In helping Ariadne find her path, he had rediscovered something of his own humanity, something worth preserving beyond mere physical survival. Ariadne would thrive here under Mara's guidance. She would grow into someone who could perhaps one day bridge the gap between her people and the remaining humans on this world, however many there might be. And he, in his own small way, would be part of that future, that potential for understanding across the boundaries of species and culture. It was, Cyril decided as consciousness faded into healing sleep, enough. More than enough to justify all the risks and pain. For the first time in 3 years, he fell asleep with something resembling hope. Outside, the Silent Peaks stood like ancient sentinels against the night sky, their blade-like forms cutting sharp silhouettes against the stars. In the perfect silence of this strange place, 3 individuals from 2 different worlds slept peacefully, their futures now intertwined in ways none of them could have anticipated when the day began. And somewhere in the vastness of this alien world, other survivors might be waiting, other connections waiting to be made, other bridges to be built between different ways of understanding and experiencing reality. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own opportunities, its own choices. For now, rest was enough. In the morning, new paths would begin. If you like this story, please click the hype button. This video deserves to be popular.